You know what it's like. You get this burst of motivation as the idea hits you. An idea for a new project to work on. Sure, you haven't finished the last project you started or the one before that, but that doesn't matter because this time it's different. You're feeling good, you get to work on it, and it turns out that this time is not different at all. Your interest fades, you lose motivation, and you throw your project into your stack of unfinished but not quite abandoned projects. So why does this happen? Why is it so easy to start new projects but not finish them? And how do you escape the vicious cycle of incompletion? Well, that's what we're going to look at in this video. And I want to start by talking about why we start but don't finish, why it's so easy to start things but not finish them. Starting projects is easy for a number of reasons, and it's useful to understand these reasons because once you understand them, you'll be able to interrupt the sort of automatic behavior patterns that happen when you start a new project. So first, starting projects is easy because it is psychologically low cost to do so. When you start a new project, you're not often considering the real costs to that project, right? You're just excited by the idea. You're driven by impulse. And it doesn't cost you anything to spend a couple of hours getting started. In fact, it's rewarding because you feel the sense of progress and motivation is high. When we're in this initiation stage, we're not thinking about the dip or the valley of despair that's to come, right? The point where you have to grind through a lot of the boring work. You have to find a different fuel source that's not just impulse and excitement and motivation. If we could think about that, then we might be a bit more hesitant to just launch into new projects because we would understand the cost better. Speaking of cost, and this is sort of an adjacent idea, there is a cost to holding a project unfinished. The more open loops you have, the more things you start and do not finish, even if you've abandoned them, the more your mental RAM is taken up, right? The more stuff you have in your head, the more distracted you'll be, and so on and so forth. So starting might be psychologically low cost, which is why it's so easy, but not finishing or keeping something unfinished, not working on it, just having it sit there, taking up mind share, is psychologically high cost, especially when it is one of many unfinished projects, when it's one of many open loops. Now that dip phase, that valley of despair we just talked about, that's also a reason why it's so easy to start new projects. When I was in the world of music production, I was producing music, I was helping others, teaching others how to do it. One thing I noticed in myself and other artists is that we would work on a song and we would inevitably get to a point where things got tough, where we lost interest in the project, in the song. We couldn't figure something out. It was at that sort of 80%, 90% stage. And at that point, you get this feeling of wanting to start something new. And maybe you do. Maybe you think, oh, I'll just start a new project. Or I have this idea for a song. And so you start that, right? And you get that excitement again. And then you rationalize it, starting this new project and abandoning the other one that was almost done, by saying, oh, this is a better idea. This is the one I'm supposed to work on. The problem was that cycle would just repeat and the new, better idea would inevitably encounter the same fate. It would be abandoned. When you encounter this difficult phase of a project, which is inevitable if you're trying to do great work, starting something new is extremely appealing because it's an easy way to ramp up your motivation and excitement levels again. You want to experience those good feelings, right? You want to experience that energy, and starting something new is a pathway to that. What makes it even easier is that you're so good at rationalizing it. There's always a reason to start something new. You can always find one or create one. You can always argue your way into it, which is why it's easy because it allows us to save face and remain consistent, at least with an internal narrative. If someone looked at your behavior externally, this constant starting of new projects and never finishing, they would probably say that you're an inconsistent person, that you lack the discipline to finish. You don't want to admit that to yourself, so you come up with these rationalizations of, well, I was working on that project, but then I figured out that this is better. And then I figured out that this is better, and so on and so on and so forth. So you create this like mental scaffolding of rationalization for your behavior that still makes you feel okay about yourself. And finally, one of the things that really drives the initiation of new projects is something called goal contagion. Every day you're exposed to inputs, right, that trigger new ideas and new projects. It might be social media, it might be a podcast you're listening to, it might be a book you're reading, it might be a conversation you have, it might even be the current project that you're working on that sparks a new idea. And when you don't have a system in place, or you're not committed to something, committed to a current project and committed to finishing, these can just blow you in all kinds of directions. You listen to a podcast, you think, oh, that's a great idea, I could work on that. Then you go work on it for a few hours and then abandon it. Goal contagion is a massive topic, and it's something I want to make a dedicated video on, but just know that it is part of the problem here. Now, these factors all compound, right? When you look at them together, goal contagion triggers a new idea, and that new idea seems better than it actually is in reality because you're struggling with another project, or you're bored, you're in that dip phase, and so you want that feeling of excitement, and then you use your expert rationalization skill to convince yourself that it's the best thing you could be doing, and you perceive it to have such a low psychological cost that it feels hard not to start. And so it's this perfect recipe, this combination of factors that makes starting projects easy. It is also the reason why finishing projects is so hard. Finishing is psychologically costly because it requires focus, discipline. Quite often it requires an embrace of the boring work. It requires negation of other opportunities, of other ideas and other projects, at least for a time. Instead of distracting yourself from the negative emotions that might rise up while you're working on a project, especially during the dip phase of the last mile by starting something new, you have to deal with those emotions head on. You have to push through them. You have to push through the self-doubt. You have to push through those voices in your head that tell you to quit and do something else. And you have to fight the constant rationalization that you engage in that tries to convince you to quit or tells you that pushing through to the end is not a good idea. But almost always, 9 times out of 10, you should finish the project. So let's talk about why you need to finish. Now, you already know that you need to finish projects, but I really want to drill this in. I want you to deeply internalize the benefits of finishing so much that it seems stupid not to push yourself through a project and see it through to completion. Now, as a disclaimer, not every project needs to be or should be finished. Sometimes circumstances change and there's no reason to keep working on something. Maybe you were building a software tool and then ChatGPT comes along and it's like, well, kind of renders this tool useless, or everyone's just going to use that instead. There are times where it doesn't make sense to continue, right? We all know this, but we're not talking about these cases. What we're talking about is removing yourself from the vicious cycle of incompletion, the constant, perpetual starting but never finishing. There are thousands of reasons why you should finish what you start, but there are 3 powerful ones that I want to talk about. The first is that the best work usually occurs during the final stages, and this is often where the most personal progress is made or the most growth occurs. Paul Graham writes, "Try to finish what you start, even if it turns out to be more work than you expected." Finishing things is not just an exercise in tidiness or self-discipline. In many projects, a lot of the best work happens in what was meant to be the final stage. The difference between a good outcome and a great outcome is often in the last 10%. Painstakingly editing the final draft is where the magic is created. Spending more time on the marketing campaign to really dial it in could result in a 10x better return on your investment. When you constantly start but never finish, you never get to these final stages. And so you never really push yourself to learn, grow, or hone your skills. Starting projects is almost always an exploitation of your current skills, which is why it's so easy, because you know how to get started. But pushing yourself to the end, pushing yourself through those final stages and toward higher standards requires struggle, it requires effort, it requires that you learn things usually, and therefore it leads to growth in a way that merely starting projects doesn't and can't. Second, finishing is a skill. And the sooner you develop it, the better, because it has a compounding nature to it. Now, this might be painful, but I want you to think back over the past 2 years at all the projects you started, but presumably didn't finish. Where would you be today if you had only allowed yourself to start a new project once the last one had been completed? If you could only work on one thing at a time until it was finished. The first time I did this, it haunted me. Still makes me very uncomfortable to think about. But if you flip it around and you look forward and you apply this, it can help you internalize how powerful the skill and practice of finishing is. It can help you envision a future where you finish what you start and where that could lead to over the next 2 years. What would it look like if you finished what you started? Now, this skill of finishing, it's a compounding skill. Just like perpetual starting compounds in a negative direction where it becomes easier and easier to start consecutive projects and harder to finish them, the more you finish what you start, the easier it becomes to finish in the future. You build confidence, you build momentum, you build this virtuous cycle. And finally, the most obvious reason, which shouldn't really need to be said, but it's worth being reminded of, is that finishing is what gets you results. You don't get results from starting. You don't actually get anything from starting other than some excitement, some motivation, some good feelings. Finishing is how you get the payoff. And that payoff might simply be the satisfaction of completing a project. I don't think that should be understated. But it's also the material things, right? The income generated from the product you launched, the increase in top-line revenue from the marketing campaign that you put together, a better physique from sticking to the 12-week workout plan, treating it as a project, thousands or millions of views on the content that you finish and you put out. You don't get access to these things if you don't finish. Finishing is what makes all your hard work worth it. Finishing is what exposes you to payoff. Starting doesn't. Okay, so let's talk about how to get on the path and actually finish something, right? And this is a very practical exercise, so I want you to do it with me. So I want you to pull up a note or a Google Doc or whatever it may be, and we're going to go through a few steps. The first is the project audit. Okay, this is phase one. What you're going to do is you're going to list every project that is currently not started, that is just an idea, that is in progress or unfinished or close to completion. Everything you can think of. You don't have to list every single task that you need to do in your life, but the things that take up a lot of your mind share, the things that when you wake up in the morning you're thinking about, or you're going to sleep you're thinking about, or you're procrastinating during the day and you're thinking, I should do this, or I haven't, worked on that in a while. List all of these out. So, for example, I have to publish video on how to set goals, write book. So probably your list is going to look longer than this. You want to put every idea down. If you've thought about it over the last 30 days and it's taken up some mind share, list it out. Even if you think, I'm never going to start this, or I'm never going to actually do this, it's just an idea. Just put it down because we need to process it. If it keeps coming up in your mind, it's an open loop and it's going to take up mental RAM. When I do this, which is around once or twice a year, this list can be quite long, like 20 plus items, because I have a lot of ideas, right? A lot of ideas for businesses, projects, so on and so forth. And if I don't deal with them, they start to just build up and I need to just list them all out. And then I need to go through the second step, which is to immediately eliminate anything that doesn't make sense. Perhaps I am a software developer and I'm trying to build my freelancing business or whatever. And I'm like, I look at this and it's like baby goods business. I'm like, I don't need to do that. Like, that's just not feasible. Doesn't make sense for me to work on given my current constraints and so on and so on and so forth. I'm just never going to work on it at all. I just know that. I don't know why I came up with the idea, but it's there anyway. So I'm just going to eliminate it. Now, if you find it hard to eliminate, then you should just leave it because you're going to deal with that in the next step. But if there's anything on your list where you're like, I don't even know why that's there. I don't know why I had that idea. That makes zero sense. I'm never going to do it. Take it off. Once you've done that, you want to assign a progress rating to each project or goal. So for example, my video on how to set goals, maybe it's at 90%, right? Write book, 10%. This, 10%, and so on and so on, going down the list. The next step is very simple. It is very effective, but it is not easy because it requires that you work against a lot of behavior patterns that you've likely built up if you are stuck in this vicious cycle of starting but not finishing. You're going to look at this list and you're going to choose the one that is closest to being finished. So in this case, in this example, it would be this: publish a video on how to set goals. It's at 90%. The reason you want to pick the one that's closest to being finished, if it's not obvious, is that it helps you escape this cycle. It helps remind you of what it's like to finish. It gives you a win. It allows you to start building momentum. It's the project you're going to work on unless you can answer yes to either of these two questions. First, did I abandon this project or am I not working on it because it makes no sense to work on anymore? Right? We talked about that earlier. Perhaps you're working on a project and you abandon it because it was like, that's just literally not going to work. Conditions have changed. My life's changed. Market has changed. What have you? If you can answer yes to that, then you should go down the list and find the next one that's closest to completion. The second question is, do I absolutely hate working on it? Does the idea of spending 15 minutes on it cause immense stress and darkness and pain? And if that's the case, then you probably shouldn't work on it either. But if you can't answer yes to either of those two questions, then this is the project that you were going to finish, right? What you're going to do, let's just pull this down here as an example. You can do this any way you want. There's no specific design or framework. But this is the project. What you're going to do is you're going to commit to this project and you're going to strategically ignore all the rest for now. And we're going to get to how to process all those in a second. As you commit to this, and maybe even as you're watching this video and going through this exercise, you might start thinking, but what about this other project that's 50% done and it's a little bit more exciting to me? What if I don't have as much conviction in the one that's at 90%? What if it's hard? What if I've lost interest? So on and so forth. This is natural, but this sequence of questioning is exactly what got you stuck in the first place. Usually it's what you engaged in that enabled you to then go start another project and abandon the current one. Again, we want to pick the closest thing to being finished so that we can start engaging in that virtuous cycle of finishing. And to do this, you might need to ramp up, psychologically ramp up your commitment level. And there's a few ways to do this, but for me, it's just about reminding myself of some truths. The first being that committing to and finishing anything is better than nothing for reasons we've looked at in this video. That commitment and finishing produces power and momentum. And that action bias, commitment and finishing, is a skill that must be developed and that it will change my identity. That it doesn't matter so much what I work on as long as I work on it and finish it. I've got an entire video on the topic of commitment, the benefits of it, how to understand this at a meta level, which you can check out. There'll be a link up here somewhere or description below. Once you've made the commitment consciously, you want to identify the action steps. What actually needs to be done to get it to 100%? Often the reason why we abandon projects is because we end up in this sort of vague space where we don't know or we haven't defined what it takes to get something over the finish line. And sometimes it's actually not that much work. In this case, publishing a video on how to set goals, it's at 90%. So maybe we've actually recorded the video and we've edited it, but there's just some psychological block or something. We haven't put it out. We haven't finalized it. And so it's what are the action steps? Well, finalize the edit. Watch through to check for errors. Create thumbnail. Decide on title. Write description. Upload. Now, as you're defining these action steps, especially with projects that aren't as close to being finished, you really want to focus on what actually needs to be done to get to 100%. You want to get clear on it. It's important that we don't fall into the trap of perfectionism, right? Where we think about all the things we could do to get something to perfect instead of the things that actually matter that can get us to done. In fact, I would argue that if you are stuck in a very vicious cycle of starting but not finishing, you should move the goalposts. You should halve the ambition of one of these projects that you have. And so, for example, if I was really struggling to get this done and it's been sitting there for months, I might say, you know what? I'm not even going to create a thumbnail. I'm just going to like upload it. And honestly, the edit's done. Like it doesn't need to be the perfect edit. You know, I'm just going to watch through to check for errors, and then I'm gonna upload it. You know, in fact, I don't need to decide on a title because I can just use the one I started with, right? And so you want to just minimize the amount of action steps. You want to apply the 80-20 rule to it. And the whole time, what you're focused on is completion, finishing, not perfection, but just done. Okay, so this is like your North Star. This is what you are committed to and what you're going to work on. The problem is, even after you've committed to something like this and decided this is what I'm going to work on, you've still got all these, right? And just because you wrote them down in a document doesn't mean they're not going to come up in your mind and distract you. And so what you need to do is essentially process these and just give them a status, right? This is not perfect. I don't think you can completely just ignore things like this, but you can help mitigate their influence on your mind. So what I like to do is give each of these their own note or document and essentially dump everything that is in my mind that hasn't been externalized. This can take some time, but it's worth it, especially for the particular projects that are taking up a lot of mind share. Some of them might not be that bad, and so you can just leave them. But for example, you know, I want to work on this. This is what I'm committed to, but I know that this launching digital product is just going to it's going to distract me. And so what I would do, imagine this is a new document, you know, I'd have like project, launch, and then I would just write down all these notes, like ideas, boom, I could, you know, SEO, I could TikTok campaigns, blah, 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 like to-dos, you're writing them all down, like task 1, finish the course, blah, blah, like you get the idea. Just write everything down, mind dump, whatever needs to be, whatever's in your head, like get it on paper. And then what you're going to do is give it a status. What I'm going to say is this project status sidelined. And you want to define what that means for you. You want to have your own statuses. For me, sidelined means I am not to work on this under any circumstances until my main project is finished. If I have any thoughts, I will come back to this document and write them down, but I will not work on it. Now, I like to have a few statuses. I like to have status, sidelined, back burner, and currently working on. Most of your projects should be sidelined because you're not working on them. But you might have a project that's a back burner, right? If I'm working on this video on how to set goals, it might be a certain type of work that I need to do. And then I've got all these other hours in the day and I could work on something else. Like I could work through a course that I'm learning about, or I'm learning how to code. And that's like a different type of work. And it would be silly for me to not maximize my time and increase productivity. And so I might have another project, another document, and then this one might be status back burner. Just like I did with the launch digital product document, I would say here, you know, this project can be worked on, but only after I have spent reasonable time on my main project. The main project should always take precedence over this. Now, writing these intention statements is very useful. It's very useful because it helps kind of remove decision making from your mind. When you don't do this, these start cropping up because you haven't defined anything. You're like, oh, maybe I should launch a digital product. I should work on that. But it's like, no, it's sidelined and you already said you're not to work on it. So just to recap, you've listed out all these projects. You commit to the one that is closest to being finished. You write out all the action steps. For the rest, you process them. So you put them into a document. Each one has its own document. You give them a status. You write an intention statement, and then you add anything else that's stuck in your mind, and you just put it all down there so you can externalize it and store it. Okay, and finally, there's the daily execution. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because half the videos on my channel are about this, are about doing the work and executing and taking action. But this is the most important part of finishing a project. You can't just write a Google Doc or a note like this and finish your project. You actually have to work on it. One thing that's very useful if you're someone who's stuck in this vicious cycle of starting and not finishing is to pull and compress your time horizon down to the daily level. Because often when your mind is distracted and you're thinking about all these projects that you could work on or should work on, you are existing in like a future-oriented mental state. And that's often why you engage in this overthinking and analysis paralysis or jumping back and forth. And so you want to really hone in your focus, not to the month, not to the quarter, but to the day. What can I do today to get this project from 80% to 90%, from 90% to 100%? What needs to be done? You've defined the action steps. What needs to be done today? What can I do? What should I do? What will I do today? One thing that's very helpful for this, which is similar to what we've done with the individual project documents, is to write a simple daily implementation statement. So when you plan out your day, and hopefully you do, simply write out a sentence or a paragraph. For example, today, I said my only goal today is to hit 4 sessions of 90 minutes of focused work. The first 2 sessions are writing sessions, focused on this video that you're watching right now. The third is recording and editing. The final session will be further editing, packaging, and publishing my video. After I have completed these 4 sessions, then I can think about and work on whatever I want or not work at all, but not until the 4 sessions are completed. So I wrote that down. There's something about using like natural language with this, about clearly stating your intentions, that helps you stick to them in a way that just listing out tasks doesn't. So I would encourage you to do that. So just to recap this process, we went through a list, listing out all the projects, all the things in our head. We then eliminated the ones that just don't make sense and aren't too much of a worry, like they're not going to take up much mind share. And then we assigned a completion rate or completion percentage, progress percentage to each one, and we chose the one that was closest to being done. We commit to it, and then for the rest, we process them. We give each one its own document and its own status, and we just dump everything that's in our head related to them in that document or note. And then we come back to our main project and we start executing. We have these action steps that we've listed out, and we just compress the timeline, focus down on the daily level, what needs to be done today, what needs to be done to push this forward. And the entire time we are looking towards completion. That is our North Star. How do we get a win under our belt? How do we finally finish something and start compounding and building that momentum? So thank you for watching. I hope this helped. If you have any thoughts, leave them in a comment below. Otherwise, I will see you next time.